Right, so it's a real pleasure to be here tonight and to get to talk to you all. I'm going to start off, as is traditional, with the talk. I think, just for those who don't know how it works, after the presentation, we'll have the main course, and then you'll have an opportunity if you have any questions for me after the main course. We'll have a bit of Q&A time, and then finally I will present questions for you to discuss over dessert, and hopefully, I think everybody's got opinions about this stuff, so I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of volunteers who are happy to feed back their discussion and their opinions from their table before we conclude. So, Frankenstein's babies. This title managed to get in a good few people, so clearly something about it got you all interested. We're going to be talking about these design a baby test tube type things, and in true interdisciplinary fashion for the Values in Society theme, we've also got the tiniest bit of literary analysis coming in too from Frankenstein. Some of you will know more about this than me because I know that it's common in GCSE study in the UK and it's not in Australia. But hopefully there will be some interesting discussion around that too. So I'm Dr. Tess Johnson, and I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself. We've had 2 Australians in a row, if you were here last week like me for Dining with Dinosaurs, and it's a pleasure to be your second Australian in a row. I moved over here for my DPhil, but before that I was at the Australian National University and at Monash University in Australia. I started off by certainly not planning to have a career in ethics, in bioethics, even though that's where I ended up. I'd originally not really known what I wanted to do out of high school. I thought, I like languages, I'll do linguistics. I like science, I'll do biology, neuroscience. And they have these nice flexible double degrees in Australia. So I thought coming out, most of the way through that I wanted to do neuroscience, and I had this funny experience where in my second to last year I thought, I'll go and do some lab work experience. And I went into the lab on my first day, and it's down the stairs in the basement of the medical centre, and I was like, all right, I'm not sure about working in a basement, but let's keep an open mind here. And then they got the mice out from the facility, and we anaesthetised the mice, and we got their brains and chopped them up and put them on slides and spent a few hours sticking electrodes in them. And this is very important scientific research, and it was a very good insight into what is involved in cellular neuroscience. And it was also a very good insight into my own capacity to do scientific research, and specifically neuroscience, working with lab animals. And I decided that wasn't for me. So that kind of turned around my research pathway and my career pathway, and it got me interested in the ethical questions with medicine and with biology and scientific development. And I happened to be doing a course for biologists at the time, which was the ethics of biology, and it started to raise these really interesting questions, particularly about genetics, and particularly about the ways that genetic technologies are developing and the power that they give us over shaping our own lives and shaping the lives of future people too. So that led me on to a Master of Bioethics at Monash and the DPhil in philosophy here. So I was at the Uehiro Centre along with Johnny and other colleagues, and Johnny was ahead of me, but I was working there for the DPhil on, as Johnny said, questions like this. What should we do about designer babies? What should we do about the potential for human genetic enhancement in the future? I've been applying that interest in the ethics of genetics since then with infectious disease ethics and pathogen genetics, so understanding the way that disease spreads, understanding genetic surveillance of disease, and I'd be happy to talk about that later as well. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to give you a bit of a flavour of what is human enhancement and what is it not. I'll talk a little bit about Frankenstein, and this is where the tiny bit of literary analysis comes in, and then I'll be bringing those together. What is a designed baby? How can we think about ethical questions that are raised by the capacity that we now have to edit our germlines, edit future people and future offspring? And I'll leave the questions for over dessert. So you might have a lot of ideas about what's involved in human enhancement, And certainly the first way that I came across this topic was thinking about Superman and Terminator and Doctor Who, Cybermen. And then I started reading a little bit about drugging in sports and started thinking a little bit about how we actually might see enhancement happening in the future. You might think about chimeras or mermaid-like creatures. And I think, this is sci-fi. This isn't where we're at the moment, so I'm sorry if you thought we were there already. We're not quite there. But we are starting to need to ask questions about what this future could look like and which of these pictures are we moving toward in the longer term. I think that one of the most pressing depictions of what this could look like is from the movie Gattaca. Has anyone seen the movie? Put your hands up. Like a few of you. Okay. It wasn't that popular. I would highly recommend it. It's talking about what could happen if we lived in a genetically defined two-tier society. What could happen if some of us were enhanced, we were smarter and more attractive, and we had more capacity to move the world forward? What happens to the rest of us, and what kind of a dynamic does that create, and what kinds of divisions? And I think that that's not where we are, but that's what we have to look at as a potential outcome of the changes that we could be making in future on the basis of how we use gene editing technologies. So what is it really and today? Well, genetic enhancement is happening all around us. It's things like cows that have been bred or gene edited in order to not have horns. So in cow breeds that have horns, often there's a quite traumatic procedure that has to happen early in the cow's life to take off their horns so that they don't end up hurting themselves and other animals in livestock factory farming conditions. So this is a really interesting case because it seems like an adaptive change. It kind of fits the environment that these cows are being raised in. But maybe we think that there are problems with that environment to begin with, and maybe this kind of an adaptive measure is beneficial for conditions that are actually problematic. And we haven't thought much about whether this would be an enhancement without those conditions being in place. You might think about everyday enhancements that we use just to benefit ourselves on a day-to-day basis. I had my morning coffee today. I even had an afternoon coffee because I wanted to make sure I was nice and awake for you for this evening. And some of us feel like, no, this is not an enhancement. This is a necessity. This is how I get by every day. But for a lot of us, what we're thinking about is my performance is higher, I've had my coffee, I'm happier or more sociable or able to concentrate on my work better. So you can think about enhancement in one way as being about altering our capacities compared to what is normal for us. You can also think about whether or not enhancement can occur or be defined on the basis of whether or not you see yourself as having a deficit or a lacking in a certain area, or whether you use something to enhance capabilities that you consider to be normal. So we see a really interesting idea with this use of Ritalin as both a study drug and a treatment for ADHD. And when we're thinking about the ways that these things are used, whether you would define your taking Ritalin as being a matter of treatment or a matter of enhancement might depend on whether you have ADHD. It might not depend on whether you have ADHD. You might see it as a cognitive enhancement either way. Or maybe actually it has negative effects for you. So I think that I'm not encouraging anyone to take study drugs, but I think that it's important to think about how we're defining enhancement and what we can think about as being real examples, kind of real life examples of potential enhancements. Going way back, for generations, we've been focused on human literacy, on kind of cultural evolution mechanisms that allow us to do more on a multi-generational basis. And the ways that we hand down our learnings can be a really important form of enhancement that occurs not just in one individual generational context, but more broadly than that. Maybe you think about superfoods, or maybe you make sure that you go and get your flu vaccine so that you've got an enhanced immune system for the next flu season. All of these are aiming to provide a bit of a more well-rounded picture of what enhancement could be compared to what you might see in superhero movies. Now, what I'm particularly interested in is genetic enhancement, and that involves using gene editing tools to insert, alter, or remove certain genes. The most famous one that people talk about is CRISPR-Cas9, so you may have heard about this gene editing tool and its capacity to be used to kind of change one person's genes or in a heritable way as well. When we're talking about changing the genes of a single organism, a single person potentially, we're talking about somatic gene editing. When we're talking about changing cells that include sex cells, so that might be eggs, it might be sperm, it might be early stage embryos, then we're talking about germline gene editing. And this raises some extra interesting questions because we're thinking about passing those potential trait differences down through the generations as well. So you can think about larger scale potential effects. Now, something that I want to avoid here and for the rest of the presentation is this idea of genetic determinism. I'm sure all of you know that we are not merely the genes that we inherit. So many of our most important traits are environmentally mediated. Some of them are quite genetic, and it just depends on the trait. So you might think maybe this could have a significant impact on someone's life for a certain kind of trait, but not for one that is more about the environment that you live in, or your epigenetics or other factors. So there are no guarantees here. So let's bring in a little bit of Frankenstein. I like to start off with this cartoon, keep things light. So we've got Frankenstein. For those who are less familiar with the text, Frankenstein is this brilliant medical doctor, and he is on this mission to really progress medicine forward. And he wants to not only improve the span and quality of people's lives, but he wants to show the medical establishment in Edinburgh that actually he can create new life from scratch. And he's been doing these experiments on cadavers, and he's been finding out about how he could kind of reanimate a body and produce new life force. And what he creates is sometimes called his creature or sometimes called his monster. And in this cartoon, it's bringing out one of the main themes of, or maybe one of the under-recognized themes of the text, which is starting to raise some of these ethical questions. You know, we would hope that any doctor is going through medical ethics training. It's not always the case, and Frankenstein might be an example of that. So, part of the way through the book, Frankenstein has been successful. He's gained this key investor in his work. He's set up this lab. He's managed to get these body parts and figure out how he can use electricity to reanimate this body. And the monster wakes up, and at first he's really happy about it. And he's saying, okay, well, this is fantastic. I have done this amazing thing. I have created a human being from scratch. What does that say about me? And on the other hand, there start to be a lot more questions for him about that, because he abandons the creature in its isolation. It grows, it has a difficult relationship with humanity and the rest of the world. It is an outcast, and eventually they have this vengeful hunting thing going on that kind of leads across the continents. And a lot of the issues here you might see as being raised by the idea to begin with that Frankenstein had, that he should be able to make this kind of an intervention and able to create new life. So I'll read out this quote from the book. When I reflected on the work that I had completed, no less a one than the creation of a sensitive and rational animal, I could not rank myself with the herd of common projectors. So he thinks himself above the rest of enterprising mankind out there. He thinks that by having done something, by having created something that is human that is equivalent perhaps to the herd of common projectors, he has put himself one rung above that because he can do this thing to create something that no one else can create. But this feeling which supported me now serves only to plunge me lower into the dust. All my speculations and hopes are as nothing, and, like the archangel who aspired to omnipotence, I am chained in an eternal hell. So there's a reference to Lucifer here, and there are kind of these themes, these religious themes coming in. He's saying, who was I, perhaps, to aspire to create new life when I am not that authority? Perhaps there's another authority out there, and this power should lie with that authority. And now I'm being punished for having attempted to be all-powerful when I shouldn't have. And the reason he's saying that is because the monster is starting to hunt him and want to get revenge for having been brought into this world only to be outcast forever. So he says, I conceived the idea and executed the creation of a man. I trod heaven in my thoughts, now exulting in my powers. And this is a key theme in the book as a whole. There are questions about what happens when we have this kind of hubris of mankind, when we think that we can do anything, and bad stuff happens, is generally the answer that Mary Shelley gives us to this question. So if you haven't gone to see one of those new movies that's come out yet, I would highly recommend them. I think that I really enjoyed watching this. So we've got Frankenstein in his lab there in this abandoned castle, and him with his creature there having a look at what he's just created. Now, it might seem that these are two unrelated things, or you might be seeing the connections here. Some biologists have argued that there's really not that much difference between Frankenstein having made his creature or his monster and scientists today who are developing and using even CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing to gene edit future people. So both of these cases raise this question, and even if you don't have religious beliefs, I think that they raise really what is an equivalent, roughly, question about whether we should play God or whether we should intervene in nature. So if you have these religious beliefs, you may see there as being a reason based on the omnipotence of God that we should not aspire to something that is outside this human realm and outside how far our powers of creation should extend. Humans reproduce, yes, but we don't create new life outside of that way of creating new life. Or we might think that this is a matter of intervening in nature. If you think that evolution has done a pretty good job so far, or if you think that there is some kind of a normative power, some kind of an important purpose that should guide what we should do about the way that nature has led for us to be the humans that we are today, then you might think that we aren't meant to create humanity from scratch, or that we aren't meant to intervene in our own genetic inheritance, perhaps because it's very complex and might lead to negative unintended consequences, or perhaps because you see there as being some kind of emergent authority from nature. So, as I said, this is something that scientists have started to do, and I think it's something that holds great potential for enhancing humanity and improving humanity's prospects in the future. We could possibly solve problems that we don't have the intellectual capacity, or we don't have the sociability to solve at the moment, or the beneficence toward each other. And perhaps through gene editing we could start to solve some of the world's greatest problems. But on an individual level, we have to start to look at the first cases where this has happened and question how they have come about and what our perhaps moral intuitions are in relation to those cases. So in around 2018, 2019, there was a scientist, He Jiankui, and he started recruiting participants in a clinical trial. not a proper clinical trial, but in an experiment that he was doing. And he was searching for couples, sets of parents who were looking to have a child, and specifically sets of parents where the father was HIV positive. And he said to these parents, all right, enroll in my trial. I'm seeking to make it so that you will never never transmit HIV, spread HIV to the child, which is a risk, but is certainly not predetermined when the father has HIV. So the idea was to make them resistant to HIV, and this is a naturally occurring genetic variant in some populations. There is a specific mutation on this CCR5 gene. The delta 32 mutation makes you resistant to HIV. I think it's something about how it changes, I don't know, the shape of your cells or receptors or something. Don't quote me on that. So this was the idea that he had, and he managed to enroll some participants. And he announced on YouTube a few months later that he had successfully done this first-in-human germline gene editing. So these embryos that were then brought to term, and the mother gave birth to twins, Lulu and Nana, and he said that they had this mutation and they were born resistant to HIV. Now that's not what subsequent testing has shown. This testing has shown that one of the twins had the edits in some of her cells and not others, so it's not necessarily very useful. And the other twin, it was just wholly unsuccessful for her. So we don't really know what the outcomes of this could be. These twins are now, a few years old, and they're going to be subject to health surveillance for the rest of their lives. And there was international outcry when this was announced. He Jiankui was kind of like the modern Prometheus, expecting to be hailed, expecting to potentially receive a Nobel Prize for this amazing scientific work that he had done. But there was already a global agreement that this technology is not safe, it's not appropriate to be used. He didn't get proper research ethics approval, and he didn't get proper informed consent from the research participants. So this led to kind of a revival of ethical examination too of this whole area of work. And it's led us to think a bit more about, is this our modern Frankenstein, and what does this say both about an individual but also about whether we should want to pursue this technology in the long run. Should we be aiming toward human germline gene editing for enhancement or not? Now you might think, well, this was health related, so maybe that's a little different, but I think that some of those examples that I showed at the start highlight that it's a bit of a murky line between what constitutes enhancement and what constitutes a health intervention. If you're preventing someone from getting a disease in the future, to what extent is it certain that they would or would not have been exposed to that? To what extent are there these off-target effects of these interventions as well? So interestingly, this genetic variant, this CCR5 delta 32 variant, is associated with increased susceptibility to West Nile viruses and other encephalitic diseases. At the same time, it's also associated with improved learning and memory. So we've got all of these potential, maybe only small on an individual scale, but possibly significant potential changes in the future human population if this were to become used or widespread. So that's just to highlight that the line between enhancement and treatment can be kind of murky, and that starts to raise questions for us about what is a designer baby, what does it mean to enhance future people, and this was really the topic of my DPhil studies. So there's lots to think about here, and I am going to not go through too many of the kind of more complex ethical arguments, but when we're thinking about what should be pursued, for me it comes down to both these individual level questions. What does it say about a potential set of parents who wish to engage in germline gene editing for a future person? What does it say about your relationship with your future child? What might that future child throw back at you as a parent based on the decisions that you have made? And I think it also comes down not only to that individualist level, but also to thinking about the collective. So, what would it mean for us to pursue this as part of an addition to human fertility, to fertility clinics and IVF services? And we already allow genetic selection in certain circumstances. So, is this just the next step in our intervention in reproduction or not? That starts to raise questions about, well, if we are considering this, who funds it? How do we think about how this sits in a healthcare system? Does it count as healthcare if we're thinking about enhancement? Who should be paying and who would have access? Would they be paying individually? Would we have this funded through like the NHS? What about countries that don't have an NHS? So the simplest way to think about this, I think, is just to think about what are the ethical arguments or the ethical reasons that we can offer in favour of the general pursuit of human enhancement using germline gene editing. And then we can also think about the arguments against. And what it's my job as an ethicist to do is to spell out those arguments in logical terms and to really have a good reflection on whether they're compelling. Are they strong arguments? Are they valid and sound arguments? Do they apply in a plausible way in the context that we're talking about? So, to some extent, this needs to be done on a very micro level, in a very context-specific way. But we can start off at least quite broad, and then as we get into the specifics of understanding what the technology could involve, or a specific actor asks us to help to inform policy decision making or something like that, then you can get down to some of the nitty-gritty of the ethical arguments. But I'll go through each of these arguments in turn, and hopefully this will give you some way to couch some of the moral intuitions that you might have so far. In fact, maybe I'll start off with getting a show of hands, which should stimulate later discussion. In general, put your hand up. I'm not going to give you any more detail than this. In general, put your hand up if you think you would be in favour of the joint pursuit of human enhancement using germline gene editing at some point in the future. Okay, and now put your hand up if you disagree with that and you would not be in favour of the pursuit of germline gene editing for enhancement in the future. Interesting, okay, so we've got a slight preference in favour of ethical reasons and in favour of the pursuit, but there was also actually quite a sizable minority of you who said that you wouldn't be in favour. I hope that will be up for discussion later, perhaps using some of the language that's raised here. So the first thing that people talk about is reproductive autonomy or liberty. So what does it mean to give parents to fulfill this moral right that people have to make decisions about their own procreation or reproduction? If I have the right to choose whether to have children or when to have children or with whom to have children, do I also have a right to say something about the characteristics or the traits of those children? Is it part of my moral right to reproductive freedom to be able to say, no, I want a child who's born with XYZ IQ, or I want a child who's actually tall, and that's not something that's going to happen to me. I've got heels on today. So, reproductive autonomy or liberty is the kind of ethical reason that centres around the parents and their relationship to the child. The second important stakeholder in this kind of a conversation is the future child themselves. So we're again still thinking on this individual level, how is the future child going to be affected? We might think of enhancement as necessarily being a good thing, but that's not always the case. As I said, there can be these off-target effects, negative unintended consequences of genetic intervention, and we might think that part of what shapes the effect that a genetic change has on a person's life is the way that they want their lives to go in the future. So perhaps a parent has a very different ideal of the good life to what the child has, and we might think that a genetic intervention that in the mind of the parent would really benefit that child doesn't necessarily benefit them from their own perspective later down the line. We might think as well about supporting public health and healthcare systems. So what does it mean to have the opportunity to maybe take stress off the healthcare system, or to support population health in a way that can prevent negative health outcomes for a whole bunch of people in future? If we could eliminate or reduce the likelihood of bad population level outcomes from chronic diseases, should we be able to do that? Is that a good reason to start intervening in future people's lives and to start offering this kind of an intervention? And finally, we might think about, well, what about an argument from analogy? Is this really that different to the kinds of enhancements that we already pursue? If we allow people to drink their daily coffee, or if we allow parents to try to give their kids a head start in educational terms, is giving them an IQ enhancement through genetic intervention much different to that, or not really? Now, equally, there are, I think, just as many reasons that you could analyse and assess in the case against germline gene editing. Ooh. There we go. And the first one of these is the one that's really brought up by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I think this idea about, are we playing God? What does it say about our nature, about ourselves as humans, if we intervene in this particular, perhaps powerful way in the lives of other future people? You can also think about the ways that this kind of intervention could impose costs or risks on others. So if a future child is enhanced, and what this enhancement involves is them being really strong-willed and go-getter and perhaps pretty domineering, what does that mean for the other people that that future child will interact with? What about when you have thousands of people that are interacting in that way? What might pose a benefit for one person can actually cause population scale harm for others. And we need to be thinking in our ethical analysis not only of the individual future person who's been gene edited, but also about other people that they will interact with and those who they won't directly interact with as well. We also would start, as we kind of got further along this route toward pursuing genetic enhancement, to start thinking about equitable and inequitable access. What does it mean in a world where we don't have equal access to genetic technologies as it is, where we have healthcare systems that are better resourced and less well resourced? Would we be starting to talk about this two-tier society, the genetically enhanced and the not genetically enhanced, particularly if we're thinking about heritable characteristics? This is where I think movies like Gattaca actually come into play, and where they raise important questions about how this could build on existing and exacerbate existing injustices that we see today. And finally, there's always this really big and important question about eugenics. There have been efforts to intervene in the human gene pool in the past, and when we think about the ways that this has gone wrong, you may have heard, the thing that people associate most with eugenics is Nazi experiments and the genocide in World War II. But even going back further, we've had other atrocious and tragic examples where there has been forced sterilization or other interventions, killing people or preventing them from reproducing, or indeed encouraging people to reproduce or forcing them to, with varying incentivization policies to aim to shape the human gene pool. And often that has, those efforts have fallen along the lines of existing discrimination and injustice in the world. So do we risk falling back again into, repeating some of those issues of the past if we go ahead with this? So hopefully this has been a good bit of a taste about some of the ethical questions that Frankenstein's babies raise. I want to leave you with this idea of our potential modern day Dr. Frankenstein. So this is per Geneviev's Twitter X page, and he's spent a lot of time and effort in defending his actions on there. So in the first post, he says that the experiment was officially approved by the Medical Ethics Committee in the hospital, that the gene editing was successful, that he doesn't regret it and he's proud that he did it, and that he's now curing Alzheimer's using gene editing. So keep an eye on that X page if you're interested in the cure to Alzheimer's. And in the second post, kind of going against his point about getting ethics approval, he says that ethicists are liars and they get paid to lie. So we've definitely got room for differing opinions in the room, and particularly online. But don't forget that we risk falling into this space where we treat ourselves as gods if we don't think about these questions and reflect on what they say about us as humans as well. So another quote, this is from the movie version, I'm not sure whether it appears in the text. So it says, having reached the end of the earth, there was no horizon left, and the achievement itself felt unnatural. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you all very much.